Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. It's been a bit since I've done a mini PC review, and that's what we're going to do here today. This one here is the new Beelink SER7, and this one's running a pretty beefy processor, the Ryzen 7 7840HS. And I've done a couple other mini PC reviews that are using Ryzen 7000 series chips, but what sets this one apart is that it's a little bit pared down in terms of features and also has a smaller size. And as an added bonus, this is a little bit cheaper. It's over $100 less than the flagship Beelink model, and so we've got quite a few perks here. In addition to saving more space on your desktop, you can also save a bit of cash. In this video, we're going to figure out whether or not those concessions are going to make it worth it at around the $620 price point. And so let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, to start, here's a look at the specs. Like I mentioned, it's running the Ryzen 7 7840HS. And this processor has 8 cores and 16 threads with a TDP that can go all the way up to 65 watts. However, this model has been clocked down a little bit less to 54 watts. A couple other things of note, we have 5600 MHz speed RAM, and it comes stock with 32 GB. In addition, we have PCIe 4.0 for the storage, and it is 1 TB. Some other additional features include 2 USB 4 ports on the back. This will be great for high-speed transfer, including 40 gigabits per second, and they can also provide video out or also be used with an external GPU, which we'll do at the end of this video. And that's probably the big rundown of the specs. The other thing to mention here is that it has Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. And you've got a couple different color options, including the green that you see right here, but then also the gray that I have in my review model. And on their website, it's priced at $730, but with a $110 off coupon. So really, we're looking at about $620. Now, I'm a little bit late in getting my review out, and so the pre-order campaign is already finished, but that's actually kind of a good thing for you because that means it's already up on Amazon. You can see here it is $730 as well, but with a $100 coupon right now. So overall, we're looking at between $620 and $630 depending on where you buy it. Now the SER7 is the compact and cheaper version of the GTR7, which I reviewed previously here on this channel. And this one is quite a bit more expensive. You can see it is $740 after you apply the coupon. So in all, we're saving about $110, $120 between the SER and the GTR7. And the differences between the two are really not that much. The main thing is going to be that the GTR7 is clocked at a 65 watt TDP profile, so you will be able to push more power into this device natively without having to go into the BIOS. And a lot of that likely has to do with the cooling power of the GTR7. As you can see, it's quite a bit bigger than the SER7, and so as a result, it just has more places to dissipate heat. Looking on the back, you can also see that the GTR7 has an additional Ethernet port, and it also has 2 additional USB-A 3.2 ports when the SER7 does not. Other than the size and those ports, the only other difference I could find between these two is that the GTR7 has a fingerprint sensor here on the top. And this is definitely a handy feature, but I'm not sure if it's going to be worth an additional $110. Anyway, when it comes down to it, between these two, I think the SER7 is more aligned to people who have less space on their desk and maybe want to save a little bit more money. So let's go ahead and jump into the unboxing. This was sent over to me by Beelink for review, and as always, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Inside the box, there's an instruction manual with some quick tips, including how to turn it on or use the VESA mount. Speaking of which, here is a look at the VESA mount itself, pretty simple to set up. And it also does come with its own mounting screws. Here's a look at the AC adapter. This is rated for 100 watts and has a special proprietary magnetic plug. And finally, it also comes with 2 HDMI cables. The shorter one is going to be if you're going to be mounting it on the back of a monitor. And here's a look at the mini PC. First impressions is that it's covered 100% in metal all around. Another thing I noticed about the top of the SER7 is that we have quite a bit of logos going on here. And so as a result, I kind of wish this was a little bit more plain. Let's go ahead and take a look at the I/O here on the front. Starting on the right, we have our power button, then a USB 3.2 port, and same thing with the USB-C port here on the front. This is 3.2. After that, we have our headphone microphone jack, and then a clear CMOS button. On the sides, we don't have any ports, but we have these big mesh panels, which will help with cooling. And then finally, let's go ahead and take a look at the back. Above the I/O, we have a large heatsink and exhaust vent. And then on the bottom left, we have our 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. After that, we have 2 USB-A 2.0 ports. After that, we have a DisplayPort 1.4, which is capable of 4K and 144 Hz. Same thing with the HDMI, this is 2.1, so it can also go up to 4K and 144 Hz. Above that, we have our 2 USB-C ports. These are both USB 4. And we also have an additional microphone headphone port here on the back. Now taking a look at the bottom, this right here is our magnetic power plug. And the way that Beelink describes this is they've made this bottom filling port because it gives them more space to put other ports on the back. Also on the bottom, we have direct access to the screws embedded in the rubber feet. In addition, they always include this little pull tab at the bottom. So after you have unscrewed it, it's very easy to pull off the bottom case. And I also appreciate the fact that they tell you exactly what buttons you need to press on your keyboard if you need to enter the BIOS. Now in terms of size, like I mentioned, this is a smaller mini PC. In fact, it's about 1.5 blocks of grass-fed butter from Costco. For a more practical comparison, here is an Xbox Series controller, which you can see is actually a little bit larger than the mini PC, at least in terms of width and height. Before we get into the software side of things, let's go ahead and open it up and take a look at what we have inside. And thanks to the fact that these screws are exposed and we have that little pull tab, it's very easy to open this up and tear it down. Now I don't want to do a full teardown here because the parts within are a little bit delicate, but I did want to confirm that we have an additional M.2 drive. So if you do want to expand the storage beyond the 1 terabyte that comes included, it's going to be pretty easy to just throw it in right here. However, if you want to change out the original hard drive or any of the RAM, you will have to do a little bit more digging into the console itself. And like I mentioned, it's a little bit delicate and layered within, so I would say that this upgrade is not going to be for the faint of heart. Finally, I wanted to show off what it looks like sitting on a desk. And here you can see it's plugged in with that bottom connector. This here is a 24-inch monitor just to give you a scale of size. But yes, this is definitely on the smaller side when it comes to mini PCs. Now let's take a look at some of those internal specs. We'll start with hardware info. And here I'm just confirming that yes, we have the 7840HS chip. And even though it is reporting here that it is a 45 watt TDP, I found it to go as high as 54 when needed. And to confirm here also, my review unit came with Windows 11 Pro. Now we're going to take a look at some of those CPU readings, starting with the idle temperature. You can see at about a 0% load, we're getting 45 degrees Celsius as the idle temperature. And in terms of CPU wattage, we're getting somewhere between 5 and 8 watts, depending on what's just kind of happening in the background. Now, when we start up Cinebench, which is going to be a CPU-intensive benchmark, you will see that all of these CPU cores are going to go to a max 100% load. And you'll see that the TDP on the bottom right will max out at about 54 watts altogether. Also, in terms of cooling, we're getting about 78 degrees Celsius. So depending on how far you want to actually push your CPU, you could actually overclock this up to 65 watts within the BIOS. For this video, we're just going to keep it here in these stock settings and just trust that Beelink has tuned this themselves. But if you are comfortable with tinkering around, I think you have a lot of room to work with given the fact that at max load, we're getting 79 degrees. And for those of you who like to follow the numbers, we're looking at 15,495 as our Cinebench multi-core score. I also did the 3D Mark Time Spy benchmark and we got a score of 3212. And that's a little bit above average of what you can expect from the 7840HS. Now, as you probably know, I'm not a huge fan of benchmarks alone. I like to do real-world PC testing. So that's what we're going to do next, starting with the low-end games and then working our way up. Now, I generally test all my PC games at a 1080p resolution, and as you can imagine, lightweight games are going to play absolutely no problem, so we're going to just dive into something that's a little bit more 3D based. So we'll start with what I consider to be Xbox 360 era games, starting with BioShock Infinite. At 1080p in high settings, I'm getting an average frame rate of about 120 frames per second, so this is going to be great. Now, Skyrim is a game that's a little bit more GPU intensive, and so because of that, you can't get super high frame rates, but it'll run just fine at 1080p at a 60 frames per second cap. Moving on from there, we have Counter-Strike Go, also running at 1080p, but a mixture of low and high settings to get the best performance. And you can see on the top right here, we're getting an average of at least 150 frames per second, sometimes up to 200. So I think this is going to be great for some of those more lightweight competitive shooters. Moving on to former AAA games, we're going to start with Doom Eternal at 1080p medium settings. And this one can hit well above 60 frames per second, I would say about 75 is the average here. Next we have Rise of the Tomb Raider, a bit more of a demanding game, but at 1080p low settings we're getting very close to a lock 60 frames per second. It would dip down to about 58 frames per second here and there, but I really didn't notice it when I was actually playing. Another AAA title that is a little bit harder to run is Control. This one I'm running at 1080p low settings, and the average frame rate here is about 52 frames per second. So in this scenario, what I would usually do is just cap it to 40 or 50 and then see what gives me the most smooth experience. Moving on from there, let's try out Destiny 2. This one's going to be at 1080p low settings, and you can see on the right here that we get pretty close to 60 frames per second most of the time, but I did definitely see it drop down here and there to around the mid-50s. Either way, this is totally playable from my perspective. Moving over to a little bit more recent and harder to play games, we'll start with Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is at 1080p with high textures and low shadows, and it's not quite hitting a 60 frames per second, but again, about 55 is the average. And for me, this is a very enjoyable experience. Moving over to The Witcher 3, we're getting somewhere around an average of 52 frames per second, so not quite as good as Final Fantasy VII, but still pretty good for how hard this game is to run. And finally, when it comes to PC games without an external GPU, the last one I tested was Marvel's Spider-Man. This one ran at 1080p low settings, and I was surprised to find that it hit 60 frames per second more often than not. You're definitely going to get a couple dips when you start swinging between buildings, but honestly, this doesn't take away from my gameplay experience either. So from my perspective, I think that this is definitely a 1080p capable gaming PC. Now, of course, I also like to test retro game emulation, so let's do that next. Of course, because this CPU is so powerful, we're going to dive right into Nintendo GameCube, and even then I'm going to push the resolution super high, so we're going to do 5x resolution. And given the fact that the native resolution on most GameCube games is 480p, this means we're running at 2400p or well over 4K. And as you can see here, these GameCube games are not skipping a beat. Every once in a while you would get some stutter at the beginning of the game, but after you play for about 5 minutes, it's a very smooth experience. And that includes even the harder to run games like F-Zero GX. So 100% across the board, this is definitely a GameCube capable device. We're going to stick with Nintendo systems all the way through, so next up is going to be Nintendo 3DS. This one generally is pretty hard to emulate, especially on Windows. But you can see here that even using OpenGL with the Citra Canary build, we're getting a 4x resolution with minimal slowdown. Much like with GameCube, you will get some stutters here and there in the beginning of the game, but the longer you play, the better it'll be. So again, I think this is going to be great for Nintendo 3DS. Moving up next, we'll go back to home consoles, starting with Nintendo Wii U. This one I pushed every game to 1080p, whether or not it even had that as a native resolution. So for example, with Wind Waker HD, this one already runs at 1080p natively, but as you can see here, it's running like a dream, so I think this is going to be a great way to play a lot of Nintendo Wii U games. There were a couple games that had some graphical glitching, like Mario Tennis Ultra Smash, but the glitches themselves were kind of few and far between, and you also have to bear in mind this is a relatively new CPU. So as we get more GPU driver updates in the future, this is something that might go away. And finally, the hardest Wii U game to emulate is Breath of the Wild. This one I did upscale to 1080p, and even then we're getting an average of about 53 frames per second. This will feel nice and smooth as you're playing the game, so if you're looking for an optimal way of playing Breath of the Wild at 1080p, this might be a very good fit. Finally, we're going to do a little bit of Nintendo Switch testing. For each of these games, I played them in docked mode using the Vulkan backend. And as you can see, these games are playing absolutely fine. I would consider Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Bowser's Fury to be kind of in that middleweight tier of emulation on Nintendo Switch, and these games are playing absolutely no problem, maybe a couple hiccups here and there as the shaders first cache. Now, Super Mario Odyssey is on the more high-end spectrum in terms of how hard it is to emulate, but you can see here that even in the beginning of the game, we're getting a pretty stable 60 frames per second after the shaders have cached. So I think the vast majority of Nintendo Switch games are going to play absolutely fine on this platform as well. And finally, I also did test that mysterious open world 3D game that came out earlier this year, and this is also set in docked mode but with a 1080p upscale. And you can see the average frame rate here is about 32 frames per second. It would dip down below 30 here and there, but overall this is still a very smooth experience and a lot better looking than on the native Switch. Okay, that's it for Nintendo systems. Now let's move over to Sony. We're going to start with PlayStation 2, and this one I'm running at a 4x resolution. This isn't quite 4K, but it's about 1800p altogether, so better than 1440p, but just not quite at 4K. And I found this to be a very good standard resolution for this emulator in particular. Basically, every single game I threw at it played at a 4x resolution with absolutely no problem. That includes even the more heavyweight games like Burnout Revenge and God of War 2. Now for the more lightweight PS2 games, you can definitely up that resolution to something like 5x or even 6x if your TV can handle it, but this really goes to show how good this CPU is when it comes to emulation. But of course it doesn't stop at PS2, let's keep going. Next up is PS3. For more lightweight games like Afterburner Climax, it'll play absolutely full speed, no problem, and same thing with those kind of middle light games like Dead or Alive 5. This one will run at 60 frames per second even when shaders are compiling. Now, one of the great strengths of this chipset is that it also works great with PS3 games in an open world environment. So something like Prince of Persia in the desert, which actually usually will bog down a system pretty bad, it plays at a very stable 30 frames per second. Another great example is going to be Infamous. This is easily the hardest game I have to emulate in PS3 within my own catalog. But you can see here we're getting an average of about 46, 47 frames per second depending on where we are in the open world. And the way I feel, anything above 30 with this game in particular is going to be nice and smooth, so this is very playable. And the same is probably going to go for just about any other PS3 game that you try to play on this machine. Okay, moving on, let's now go to Microsoft. We're going to start with the original Xbox. Now this one is notoriously hard to play on Windows, but you can see here that a 2x resolution still plays many of these games very well. Halo Combat Evolved is a little bit on the easier side, but Dead or Alive 3 is not. Even so, this one is playing at a very stable 60 frames per second. Also, some games that are hard to play on the original Xbox are sports games. But here we have NBA Live 06 running at a 2x resolution and still keeping a pretty steady frame rate. If you look in the video debug window below my stats, you will see that it's dipping below 60, but the gameplay itself is still nice and smooth. And finally, in terms of emulated systems, we're going to do Xbox 360. We'll start with Crackdown here, and we're running everything at the native resolution. This game is running absolutely no problem, including games that are a little bit harder to run, like Project Gotham Racing 4. Now, the Xbox 360 emulator is still a work in progress, and so as a result, it's really going to come down to compatibility. And there are some games that just won't run on this emulator, at least not right now. However, I did find that every Xbox 360 game that runs on this emulator will run just fine at full speed on this PC. So I think that's a great sign, especially when you start to consider how compatibility will improve over time. Now I have a couple other tests that I did before we start wrapping up. Number one, I tested this with an external GPU. This here is a GPU enclosure made by Ryzen, and inside I have a Radeon RX 6650 XT. This isn't the best GPU in the world, it comes out at about $250 new, but it is very good for 1080p gaming. For example, here with Doom Eternal running at a 1080p Nightmare settings, I'm getting an average of about 120 frames per second. Now, one thing to bear in mind is these external GPUs use an older version of Thunderbolt, and as a result, there is a bottleneck when it comes to data transfer speeds. This means that even though the 6650 can probably do better in terms of performance, the Thunderbolt connection will actually limit the overall performance. A good example here is God of War. I can play this at 1080p Ultra settings, but if you look here on the top left corner, I'll zoom in a little bit to make it easier to read, we're only getting an average frame rate of about 58 frames per second. And if I was to put this GPU directly into a computer, then I would probably get something closer to 90 or 100 frames per second. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm describing that bottleneck with the GPU connection. And truth be told, I had planned on doing a full review of this external GPU. However, due to these bottlenecking issues, it has basically sapped all my motivation to make the video because it's not as great as I was hoping it would be. And on top of that, this external GPU enclosure is expensive. I think I spent about $600 or $700 with the full setup. And there's no way that the performance increase right here warrants that price tag. After all, this is more expensive than the computer itself. Just to highlight that, we're going to play God of War again, but only from the computer and not the GPU. And I'm also still playing at 1080p, but I did drop the settings down to low. However, as you can see here, I can cap it to 40 frames per second and it runs just fine. And so this really just adds fuel to the fire of my argument of why the external GPU is just not worth it. If we can get 40 frames per second at 1080p low settings, which still, by the way, looks great in God of War, then I just can't justify spending $600, $700, $800 to get a new GPU as well as an enclosure just so I can play 1080p with a little bit better graphics. So if anything, what I'm really saying here is that I may not ever get to the review of this external GPU just because I don't think it's going to be worth your time or mine. But all the same, if you have an external GPU enclosure already and you're looking to use this with the SER7, I am here to confirm that yes, the USB 4 port works just fine. And finally, the last thing I tested is Batocera. This is a Linux-based custom operating system focused on retro game emulation. And the great thing about Batocera is that the entire ecosystem is housed within a different storage medium. For example, it can be flashed on an SD card, put on a USB thumbstick like what I'm doing here, or you could even load it up onto that additional M.2 SSD drive that we have within the SER7. And there are some excellent benefits from emulating on Linux. For example, emulating the original Xbox just seems to work out better. If you remember in Windows, we got everything at about a 2x resolution, but here within Batocera, I can pump this up to a 4x resolution and it's working just great. I was getting a dip here and there, but all the same, this is a big improvement over what we were seeing on Windows. So in the end, if you wanted to use a USB flash drive to run Batocera, this is going to be a very excellent PC to do so. Okay, that's really about it for my testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talking about what I like and what I don't like about the SER7. To start, as you can imagine, I like this compact size. After all, this can do just about everything I would expect out of a high-end mini PC, but it does it with a smaller form factor. I also think that Beelink did a very good job in choosing the I/O both on the front and the back. I always like having both USB-C on the front and back, and I think it's a smart move to put the USB 4 dongles on the back because that means you can put an external drive there and it'll stay out of the way. I also think the cooling power here is excellent. I got 79 degrees at a 100% load, and in all my game testing, I never saw it go above 70 degrees Celsius. This also implies to me that if you want to raise the TDP ceiling, you will probably still get some pretty good temperatures too. Now, one confession I have to make is that when putting all this footage together, I forgot to film the actual fan noise. And the reason that happened is because what I will usually do is test all of the things that stand out to me and that I notice. But in all of my testing, I never noticed the fan kicking on to a point where I would call it loud in any sort of way. In fact, when I was doing all of my game capture, all of that is getting pushed over into my MacBook. And I remember thinking to myself that the MacBook is actually a lot louder than the SER7. And again, all that the MacBook was doing was receiving that video signal. So I think that's just another testament to the SER7 and how quietly it runs. So again, if noise is an issue for you, I think the SER7 is a safe bet. Finally, let's talk about performance. Now, I do think that this is worth classifying as a 1080p gaming PC. As you saw in my testing, as we got to the higher end games, yeah, they wouldn't really hit 60 frames per second. But I think if you're comfortable with a 40 frames per second cap, you're going to be able to play just about everything that's on the market today. And I think the fact that I never had to drop down the resolution below 1080p in all my testing is a testament to just how powerful this device is. In addition, I think this is the first mini PC that I've ever used that I'm actually going to label as an emulation beast. I definitely prefer not to use that term, but in this use case, I think it's actually a pretty good fit. If you think about it, the definition of a beast is something that is ferocious. And for me, I would consider something to be ferocious if it outperforms its physical size. Kind of like a really angry toddler. And in that case, I think the SER7 fits that bill. It is very small, but can do way more than you would expect. After all, it can emulate every single system that has an emulator right now. Not only that, you can actually upscale the resolution on most of those as well. So yeah, I think this is a good time to actually call something an emulation beast, and the SER7 definitely fits that bill. Now, of course, it's not perfect, so I do have two things I want to address. Number one, I'm not a huge fan of that top design. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I do like things to be a little bit more clean and not so ornate. So this may not be something that bothers you, but it is something that I looked at and thought to myself, man, I wish this was a little bit more simple. Additionally, let's talk about that $620 or $630-ish price point. I think the components that we're getting inside, plus the PC and emulation power, combined with that smaller size, does justify that price. You can definitely still build your own PC for about $600, but it's going to be way bigger than what you have here. So as always, it'll come down to that form factor. Do you want a smaller PC? And if this is within your budget, I think this is still a very good value. Now, I'm going to leave this link down below, but I have a whole spreadsheet of every mini PC I've ever tested here on this channel. And at this point, we have over 30 here on the list. These are all sorted by price from low to high. And you can see that the SER7 is in the bottom 2/3, meaning it is on the more expensive side. However, at $630, if you compare it against others within that price range, you'll see that you have to put in quite a bit more money to actually match that performance, about $50 additional. The only thing that outperforms it in terms of emulation is the Apple M2 Mac Mini. But of course, you have to bear in mind that the Mac Mini is not going to be good for PC gaming. So I think overall, if you're looking at around that under $650 price point, the SER7 is the device to beat. And that's why I've given it the coveted yes on the leftmost column. This is what I designate as my top pick within any given price range. So in the end, let's go back to that question that I asked at the beginning of the video. And that is whether or not the smaller size of the SER7 justifies the price difference between the GTR7 and this one we're reviewing here today. And as a reminder, the price difference here is about $110 between the two. And the way I see it, the additional I/O that you're getting in the GTR7 and that fingerprint sensor are just not worth it. And so if I personally was in the market for a mini PC, I would probably choose the SER7 between these two. Even though I think the size of the GTR7 is still really nice and small, I like the fact that the SER7 is even smaller. And of course, I love the idea of saving a bit of money along the way. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you are in the market for a mini PC, is the SER7 a good fit for you? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.